Peter L. Bergen, author of Holy War, Inc., Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden. You say on page 31, further clouding our understanding of bin Laden is the fact that a vast amount has been written about him, a good deal of it rubbish.
Well, I think, you know, when rubbish is rubbish, you call a spade a spade a spade. And, you know, I mean, there have been a lot of reports that bin Laden was womanizing and sort of drinking when he was a teenager in Beirut. It's very hard to disprove it's very hard to disprove something that didn't happen. But, you know, as far as I can tell, he was a sort of very religious teenager. There were reports that somehow bin Laden was funded or trained by the CIA. These fail all sorts of common sense tests apart from anything else. You know, if you were the CIA case officer who ran bin Laden, most of those people would be at retirement age now. You've got a $20 million book contract right there. I mean, you know, when conspiracies happen, and you know, Iran-Contra, these kinds of conspiracies, people talk about them. So the notion that somehow CIA was involved in training or funding bin Laden, who was A, had a lot of his own money, B, was pathologically anti-American from an early age, it sort of defies common sense.
I found it interesting, you actually named the publications and went specifically to the point they were making. Jane's Intelligence Review, which reported that bin Laden may have obtained an engineering degree in the United States and was financed by the CIA. You even call it respectable. Why would they publish something like that?
I think that, you know, it's because bin Laden is libel-proof incommunicado, his family isn't speaking, largely incommunicado, and, you know, he's public enemy #1. You can write anything that kind of occurs to you. And I mean, I think the bar about, you know, if let's say Jane's Intelligence Review was writing about, let's say, Jim Woolsey or some well-known, you know, they would be able to check these things. I mean, they would find out where did Mr. Woolsey go to school, and you know, Jane just repeated something that was sort of hearsay, and you know, it's a very good publication. But I think I wasn't trying to single them out. I'm just saying that there's been a lot of stuff written about bin Laden, not all of it very accurate.
You mentioned Joseph Bodansky,
yeah,
who had a bestseller for a while. It was on it may still be on there, as far as I know.
Yeah.
You say one of the examples of misinformation about bin Laden can be found in the tome by Joseph Bodansky, who enjoys the title of Director of Congressional Task Force on Terrorism. Do you know what that is?
It's a Republican task force on terrorism.
Says in Bin Laden, the man who declared war on America, Bodansky describes the teenage bin Laden visiting Beirut to drink, womanize, and get involved in brawls. Never did that.
Not according to people who know him.
Those who know bin Laden, however, describe a deeply religious teenager who married at the age of 17. Bodansky makes another fantastic assertion that the 1996 crisis of TWA 800, which killed 230, was a joint operation between Iran and bin Laden.
Yeah.
No proof at all that ever happened.
I mean, you know, TWA 800 went down for reasons that the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the FBI concluded was an accident. It's not very exactly clear why the accident, but I mean, trying to pin bin Laden, you know, for the TWA 800 or Iran, I don't think it's very responsible for somebody who works, you know, for Congress.
How did you then go about making sure that, and you've got so many connecting points in this book, that it was accurate?
I tried to, you know, like any book, there are probably there are probably errors of, you know, in there, but you know, I try to be somewhat responsible about what I put in, or, you know, basically the threshold had to be, let's say, sufficiently high. You know, having worked at CNN, you know, for say working at CNN, I mean, what that's the sort of tradition I come out of. So I've tried to sort out some of the myths and some of the rumors, and try to really actually report and actually go and meet the people who knew bin Laden, or, you know, were involved in his group in some way, or the people who were tracking him, and rather than relying on secondary sources. Obviously I do rely on secondary sources, but I try and rely on secondary sources that are either, you know, reputable publications or books, or, you know, trial transcripts. I mean, I think court testimony is a very useful, in the embassy bombing attacks, the subsequent Manhattan trial. There was about, I don't know, it must be every page generated 150, every day generated 150 pages of testimony, and there were about 70 days. So but there was a wealth of information in those court transcripts. I used those, and trying to talk to as many people on different sides of the story as possible, whether they were American government officials, people who were broadly sympathetic with bin Laden, Arab journalists who've met with him or know about him, Pakistanis. You know, I mean, the way to get a complete picture is to talk to as many people as possible, obviously.
You went to his father's village.
Yeah.
When did that happen? Where is it? What did you find?
It's a beautiful place in the Hadramaut, which is a very remote area of Yemen, in eastern Yemen, and it looks perhaps a little bit like Arizona. It's sort of the mesas almost. There's cliffs, and there's honey-colored cliffs, and in one of these, at the end of one of these valleys, you can find the town of Al Rabat, which is Bin Laden ancestral village, and it's about 5,000 people. It doesn't, if you go there as a Westerner, it's you're kind of a big deal. I mean, all the kids in the village just start running after you, and it's not a place that's regularly visited. Bin Laden's father left the village when he was a young man to go and seek his fortune in Saudi Arabia, but the family retained some links to the village. They gave some money for an irrigation project, and there is a house there which is on Bin Laden Street, which is this rambling, old, decrepit place which now houses kind of an extended family. Some of them are distant relatives of Osama bin Laden, and it's so big that part of it is the village school. But I went there with John Burns of the New York Times, who's a wonderful reporter, and we went to go and talk to some of the remaining cousins who were there.
What does it mean if you're from Yemen? What's that in that part of the world over there? Where is it located? What borders Yemen?
Okay, well, to the south it's the Arabian Sea, and then to the north it's Saudi Arabia. So a lot of Yemenis went to Saudi Arabia because basically to get Yemen is a very, very poor country. I think it's the poorest country in the Middle East probably. And so you get a lot of immigration, and one of the people who immigrated was Mohammed bin Laden, the father of Osama. But he was part of a pretty big movement. And one thing that's interesting about bin Laden's organizations, you'll find that some of the key people are Saudis, but they actually have Yemeni backgrounds, like bin Laden himself. For instance, the person who's regarded as being the mastermind of the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen last year is somebody whose family originates in Yemen, but grew up in Saudi Arabia, fought in Afghanistan, like bin Laden against the Soviets.
How close is Yemen to Afghanistan?
Yemen is, quite some distance. You'd have to go. You'd have to fly. I don't know. It's about 1,500. I'm guessing 1,500 miles, 1,000 miles, perhaps. Quite some way.
What's the population of Yemen?
The population of Yemen is 17, 18 million. One interesting thing is that they. Am I getting confused? I think the number of guns in Yemen may be that number, and then the population may be lower. I'm a little.
I remember the statistics: 65 million guns,
right.
And 18 million people.
That's exactly right. That's right. 65 million guns, 18 million people. So, like Yemen is very similar to Afghanistan. Physically, it's very beautiful. It's mountains, it's deserts. It's tribal. There's been quite a tourist industry in Yemen, except that has been impacted obviously by terrorist events and kidnapping of tourists. But it's one of the seven wonders of the world is the bazaar in Sana'a, Yemen. Literally one of the seven wonders of the world. I think UNESCO called it so, and it's really like stepping back into the Middle Ages. You see camels wearing blinkers, and they're making sesame oil in these giant mortars and pestles, and you see. It's like a scene out of some medieval painting, but it's real. It's happening now, and it's a wonderful place. Unfortunately, bin Laden's group managed to function pretty well there. They were able to bomb the USS Cole. There were plans earlier this year in June for some of bin Laden's followers to bomb the U.S. embassy there. So it remains a place where pockets of Al Qaeda exist. Although the Yemeni government has been apparently quite cooperative with the United States government in terms of trying to close Al Qaeda down there.
You point out in the book that there was an attempt at bombing the Sullivans.
Yeah.
The ship, the Sullivans. When did that happen, and how much of that do we know now? How much of it's public?
Well, I think quite a lot of the USS the Sullivans was a sort of dress rehearsal for the Cole, and that occurred on January the 3rd, 2000, which was towards the end of Ramadan. In that particular year, and basically what happened is the bombers overloaded their boats with explosives, and it sunk. But they learned from their mistakes, and they came back and they did the USS Cole. But the interesting thing about the Sullivan's attack was that, or the planned attack on the Sullivans, was that it was going to be part of a sort of terrorist spectacular involving the bombing of Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, and also bombing tourist sites in Jordan. And all these things were going to be related for the new millennium. And none of them actually worked out, either because of incompetence of the plotters or good police work, but it shows A, that Al-Qaeda's had its share of failures, as it were, luckily, but B, it shows the these rather grand scale plans. I mean, this was a plan to kind of, not simultaneously, but within the same time period, blow up an airport in America, blow up a US warship in Yemen, and also blow up places associated with American tourists in Jordan. And it would have been pretty devastating.
Where do you think the U.S. intelligence has been in all this?
Well, it's very easy to Monday morning quarterback, because obviously September 11th was the biggest failure of intelligence gathering in American history, and no one can argue with that fact. On the other hand, it has to be said that U.S. law enforcement and the intelligence community knew that bin Laden was a pretty serious character quite early on. As early as 1995, the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, which has basically handled a lot of the terrorism cases, the initial Trade Center bombing in '93, for instance, they were asking people in a terrorism trial, do you know Osama bin Laden? That was in '95. And lawyers who were in the case at that time said they were kind of mystified who was this Osama bin Laden, even though they knew a lot about the case. Why was it the prosecutors were asking about him? So his name was beginning to surface in '95 for American law enforcement and prosecutors, because his name kept cropping up too often, I think, is what happened. By '96, the U.S. State Department was calling him the most significant financier of Islamic extremism in the world, and actually had a very detailed white paper about who this guy is. He has training camps in Afghanistan, Sudan. And also, I think, around about the same time, the CIA founded its own separate unit devoted to bin Laden, which is sort of an interesting, there was a counter-terrorist center within the CIA, and to have set up this specialized unit, which is allowed to function apparently in given quite a lot of latitude to function without having to deal with the Washington bureaucracy so much. So, I mean, the United States government was well aware that bin Laden was a very dangerous man. On September the 10th, he was already on the 10 most wanted list, and he had a $5 million reward on his head, so unprecedented. So it's easy to sort of say, well, that was a huge failure. And on the other hand, I mean, both statements are true. It was an intelligence failure, but also the U.S. government, had put a lot of effort into going after him. I mean, the fact is that his group is sort of sui generis. I mean, very unusual in the sense that it was very disciplined and very organized. And if you think about the terrorism that happened against American targets in the 80s, there was the Marine barracks bombing, which killed more than 200 Americans in 1983. Well, that was, but it was never on the scale. The thing about this group is that they kept making their plans more and more complex and more deadly as time went on. One can only hope that the Trade Center represents the apex.
Before I go on, let me ask you some questions about you.
Yeah.
Where were you born?
I was born in Minneapolis.
What year?
1962.
How long did you live there?
My parents and the family moved to Paris when I was 3, and then we moved to London when I was 5 or 6.
How long did you stay there?
Lived in London basically my entire life. Went to high school in Yorkshire, the north of England, and went to university at Oxford, and then returned to the United States after I left university.
And why did you go to Oxford? And what did you study?
I studied history.
What kind of history?
Modern history, which at Oxford begins with the Anglo-Saxons. Why did I go there? I mean, it's an incredibly beautiful place. It was a wonderful time to go. And
your Magdalen College?
New College.
New College?
Yeah. Which is across the street. And New College is, I think, founded in 1369 or whatever. So, but I had a great time there. I didn't really, there weren't that many requirements to work really. And everybody, it was funny because at that time, the English government actually paid for you to go to university. They gave you, I mean, now you have to pay something yourself, but at that time, not only was the education free, but they actually gave you money to have as spending money. So it's kind of a very different philosophy than the kind of, but of course now the British government is asking people to pay, but it's still, relatively speaking, very inexpensive.
British citizen or American citizen?
I'm American.
Did your parents move back here with you?
My mother stayed in England for another I guess, 10 years. And then she's moved to Washington relatively recently. And my father now lives in the United States as well.
So when you came here from Oxford, where'd you go?
I moved to New York.
What'd you do?
I became a messenger. Or I had a job called desk assistant, which basically meant dog's body at ABC News, and that was my first job. But it was a very good way to sort of get to know Manhattan, because you sort of, taking packages here, and also kind of a good way to get to know the business, because you kind of, just by process of osmosis, you kind of began to learn a little bit about business. There's no reason to employ somebody, doesn't matter where they've been to school, if they don't know, So it was kind of like, that's the opening job you get, and then, you kind of get promoted as you go along.
What'd you do? How long did you stay at ABC?
5 years.
And what did you end up being at ABC?
I worked, my last job was at 2020, where I was, like a production assistant, associate producer, whatever, on different projects. I had 2020 was a very nice place to work. There were very nice people, and I was able to I met Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan after Ronnie Reagan had retired, which was pretty amazing, as a kid to spend a day with him. He was exactly how everybody said he would be. He was very charming and very pleasant, and Nancy seemed to completely run the show.
And when did you decide to leave ABC, and where'd you go?
I got a job offer at CNN, which was early in 1990, and from my boss, Pam Hill, at the time. And she was setting up a unit at CNN to do documentaries, investigative pieces, etc. And I decided to go there, and it turned out to be quite good timing, because the Gulf War then happened, and it was a great time to be at CNN. I feel very lucky that I was at CNN in a way, because if you're interested in news, where else better to be? I mean, that's what they do.
So in 1990, you would have been how old?
I think I was 27. 27, yeah.
So you've been there ever since?
Yeah, well, except I resigned to write the book 2 years ago.
Go back to the first time you ever thought about Osama bin Laden.
I think the very first time I really thought about it seriously was an article by Judith Miller and Jeff Gertz in the New York Times, around about the time the State Department released this kind of rather detailed fact sheet about him. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because it always seemed to me that the bombing of the World Trade Center when you're a prosecutor, there's a rather narrow set of things you're looking for. I mean, who bombed the Trade Center? And that question was solved by the trials. But who was behind the bombing wasn't ever really asked very seriously, it didn't seem to me. Perhaps because it just didn't seem that necessary or whatever, but there was something kind of odd about the people. They came from Peshawar, Pakistan, Ramzi Yousef, the mastermind. They seemed to have money from somewhere. They must have had training to build these explosives. I mean, who was doing all that? They didn't just suddenly show up in Brooklyn and know how to build a huge bomb. And it turns out, the more that you look at that case, the more it's clear that it was sort of a proto-Al-Qaeda operation. I mean,
what year was all this that you read that article?
Oh, when I read the reason that when I read the article was 96. It just, the Judith Miller, Jeff Gertz piece just sort of said, it looked at these Middle Eastern businessmen, including bin Laden, saying, kind of, who are they? So I went to my bosses at CNN, Pam Hill and John Lane at the time, and I said, I think we should really look at this guy. And they had previously encouraged a documentary that I was involved in, which looked at the Trade Center bombing and the connections to Afghanistan. So they encouraged me to go and do to try and find out if we could meet with bin Laden.
And
well, I mean, that was quite a performance. It was we went to, initially I called this contact in London, somebody by the name of Khalid Al-Fawaz, and I said we were interested. He said, fine, there's certain things I don't want to chat about on the phone. So I went to London, I spent about a week with him, and basically kind of laid out that we would give bin Laden a fair hearing.
Again, what year are you doing this?
This is early 97.
Okay.
And about a month, I also met with somebody that was going to take us to bin Laden if we met. But anyway, it was sort of like there was a certain sort of screening process that was going on. They wanted to make sure that we weren't agents of the American government in some way, or they also wanted to make sure that we would kind of give him a fair hearing, explain that we would give everybody a fair hearing. About a month later, I went back to Washington. I got the call saying you're on, and myself and the correspondent Peter Arnett went to London. We met up with our cameraman, and two other people who knew, kind of related to bin Laden, and they took us to Pakistan, where we kind of kept going through a series of different hoops about each stage of the way, and finally we get to Afghanistan, which is the final hoop, and we're in Jalalabad, not too far from from Tora Bora, of course, where Al Qaeda is presently holed up.
Now, had you been to Afghanistan before that?
Yes.
When?
Yeah. I went in '93 for quite some time. There was a war, the war in Afghanistan between the forces of. There was a civil war in Afghanistan even after the Afghan communists were defeated, which was ripping. The ironic thing is, Kabul, the capital, had basically survived the whole communists without being destroyed. It was the Afghans themselves who destroyed it, principally the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was the prime minister at the time, who was probably the only prime minister in history to be shelling his own capital on a daily basis. So I was there in '93 during that period. We interviewed Hekmatyar. We also interviewed Akmal Shah Massoud, who of course is now dead, unfortunately. And that was in the context of trying to find out how the Trade Center bombers in '93, what their connections to the Afghan war against the Soviet Union had been. So in '97, I'd been once before. '97 was the second time I went.
Did you sense at that time, and based on your study at Oxford and the history and all that this was a bigger thing than most people were paying attention to?
No, I don't think so. I did all the things that I've done because I was interested in them, rather than sort of thinking these is going to turn into a big story. Because and I got interested in Afghanistan or Pakistan in 1983 when I was a student at university. A couple of friends and myself made a documentary about the Afghan refugees in Pakistan.
Who were you doing this for?
We kind of did it on our own steam, and then it showed on Channel 4 in England after we kind of got it together. And the two people I was with knew more than we didn't know anything really between ourselves, but we kind of the innocence engendered by being very young and optimism, and we sort of thought we could do this. So we shot it on film, and then it was shown on English television. But anyway, that got me interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I went back at it with ABC News. We did a story in Pakistan about the legal status of Pakistani women, which was obviously pretty bad, even under Benazir Bhutto, who was then Prime Minister at the time, who wasn't really able to get the religious parties to get off, as it were, and liberalize the situation. But so my interest really started with just being interested in the country, the places, rather than sort of an interest in terrorism.
So go back to your '97. You're on your way. You're in Pakistan. You're on your way to you're in Afghanistan.
Right.
How long did all that take, by the way, from the time you leave here to the time they finally got you in country?
I don't know. It must have been. Which each of these phases, by the time we actually, it must have taken at least 2 weeks from Washington to meeting bin Laden. I'd say at least 2 weeks.
And it's just you and Peter Arnett and the camera person?
Yeah, Peter Juvenile is the camera person, who actually is a former British Army officer who spent more time in Afghanistan as a journalist than anybody else. He's the sort of person who really. Peter's line is, any fool can get into a difficult situation. That it's like getting out of it that is the complicated part. So Peter Arnett and Peter Juvenile, Cameron and I, had been to Afghanistan before, and they were exactly the right people in case something. Arnett obviously has been in many war situations, and they were the right people to have around if anything did go wrong. And one of the things that went wrong almost immediately was that the week before we went to see bin Laden, the Taliban banned the photography of any kind of person. so we're sort of in a quandary about whether to go to the country illegally and be thrown out because we didn't have visas, or if you apply for a visa, they're going to ask you, what are you doing? And so in the end we decided not to apply for visas and just go in and take our chances. And like a lot of things that are never very clear in Afghanistan, it was never clear to me that the Taliban knew that we were there to interview bin Laden and had sanctioned it, or that they just couldn't care less. They weren't that interested in who we were. You stick out like you're pretty obvious if you're living in Jalalabad and in a hotel for several days, not really doing anything. It's like, who are these people? But they never really asked us. It was kind of odd.
So how did you get to the man himself?
That was after we had a meeting with his media advisor, who basically said, he looked at our camera equipment and said, you can't take any of this because we're concerned about bin Laden's security and any kind of electronic device that might give away his location. They were very paranoid, basically. And so he said, well, you can do your interview, but it'll have to be with our equipment. And there's no point in arguing the matter. I mean, it was either that or no interview. So, you know, we had a sort of series of different trucks. We had a van and then a sort of Jeep, and we were blindfolded, and it was the middle of the night, and, you know, we went through various concentric rings of security around bin Laden. We were searched in a professional manner. They basically made it clear at a certain point, if we had a tracking device, that if we told them now, it wouldn't be a problem, but if we told them later, it would be definitely a problem.
Were you at all afraid for your own life in this situation?
No. First of all, they'd invited us. You know, they weren't going to screw around with us. And secondly, I mean, rather than being frightened, I was actually quite thrilled. I mean, not thrilled, thrill's the wrong word. I was happy that this was coming off. I mean, I spent a lot of time and effort trying to organize this, and we were there. We didn't really know how the whole thing was going to end, but it was, you know, something we'd all spent a lot of time and effort trying to get to that point. So the fact that we were now going up the mountain, we didn't know exactly where we were, but I'm pretty sure we were in the White Mountains, where that Al Qaeda base is located, somewhere near there.
And how long were you, I mean, at what time of day did you travel, and how long would you travel at any given time?
They arrived at dusk, and so it must have been around 5 p.m. And we weren't allowed even to take watches, so we had no idea what time it was exactly. But I estimated it was sometime before midnight when bin Laden finally showed up. And he wasn't going to hang around. He just wanted to do the interview and go. I mean, he was with his entourage.
How many in his entourage?
I think I counted a total of maybe 30 people that I saw over the course of the night, maybe around him. In the direct entourage, there were maybe, I don't know, 10.
Armed?
Yeah, everybody's armed, and, you know, some of them spoke pretty good English.
And what was your sense of the kind of people you're around? Were they smart people?
Well, I think they divided into two groups. There were some kind of people who seemed not that smart, who were like kind of the protection people. They just seemed like foot soldiers, and they were a group of some Middle Eastern faces and some African faces. And then there were some people who were kind of in charge. They spoke very good English. They seemed to be Saudi. There was a translator who spoke impeccable English, and who appeared maybe to be a cleric. Yeah, so I think they divided up into kind of the people who were just, you know, kind of the muscle, and then the people who were running the show.
The interview itself taped for how long?
About an hour. Peter Arnett and I had worked up a lot of questions for bin Laden, and he didn't want to answer anything about his personal life, his family, his finances. He just wanted to talk about, you know, why he was declaring war against the United States, which after all was the reason that we were there. It wasn't about his family history. We were trying to find out who this guy is, why has he declared war against the United States. And in a nutshell, you know, the main thing, that his main gripe is the continued presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, which he regards as infidels, trespassing on the Holy Land.
What did you see up close in person that you can't see on video?
I don't know, he has a sort of almost like feline aspect. I mean, he's not a kind of very macho kind of guy at all. He's more, he was pretty low key, and he didn't strike me as being particularly charismatic. I don't speak Arabic, so maybe there's more charisma when you understand him in the native tongue. But yeah, he doesn't have this, like, you know, light bulb like personality, or he doesn't swagger. He was almost, you know, you could barely hear him speaking because he was so low key. I mean, I think he had a cold at the time, but he just came off as being mild mannered.
And what did CNN do with the interview once you were finished?
Well, we went back and we edited. We put the text of the entire interview on the internet, but we edited it down into a 20-minute really profile of who is this guy and what is he doing, or what has he done, what is he being accused of doing, and we used the best stuff from the interview. I mean, the interview was, you know, I mean, you've seen bin Laden. He can ramble on a lot about stuff that isn't that sort of germane in a way, but. So that interview, this profile aired in May of 1997.
This is really off the subject, but every time when I see these stories about folks like you going up into the mountains and hours on the road, the one question that's never answered is, where do you get your gas?
But they were driving us.
Well, where do they get? I mean, are there gas stations along the way?
Well, you know,
you ever run out of gas over there?
I guess they must keep gas in the car. I mean, there aren't. I mean, there aren't many gas stations in Afghanistan. It's a good question. I don't know where, but they certainly were driving around a lot at night. I mean, they must keep jerry cans in their jeeps or whatever. I hadn't really occurred to me. But
you go back to Muhammad bin Laden, the father, back to Yemen. What year did he go to Saudi Arabia?
1930, and he founded the family company in 31, and then the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was founded in 1932. Although, you know, the Saudi family had been sort of gathering pieces of the puzzle to make the kingdom. But he became very close to King Fahd, and was able to, you know, build palaces, and the family renovated Mecca and Medina.
What year did he die?
He died in 67.
1967.
When bin Laden was 10.
And how many wives did he have?
Well, only 4 at any given moment, but I think my understanding is perhaps up to 10 or 11.
And how many children total did he have?
Around 50.
And where did Osama bin Laden fit into that?
He's supposedly the 17th son. He's the only son of one of the mothers. So there was a Syrian mother, and bin Laden has 2 full sisters. But the family's a pretty large one. I mean, you know, 50 siblings of one stripe or another. And now, of course, there's another generation. So those kids have all had kids. So, you know, somebody was saying to me that there are like 200 plus first cousins who are now make up the bin Laden family. And
Osama bin Laden himself, you talk about in the book, got a 4th wife after you saw him, or was that?
He got a 4th wife in the early 2000s.
Are they? How do they? When you have 4 wives, how do you deal with them?
Well, the Quran says, or if you're only supposed to take as many wives as you can actually support, and 4 is the maximum. So, you know, obviously bin Laden's got the resources to support 4 wives. But you know who those wives are exactly. The most recent one is a Yemeni, but there's not a hell of a lot of information about bin Laden's family. There is a son called Abdullah who lives in Saudi Arabia, who's the oldest, who sort of rejected his father. And there's also a very young daughter, I believe, in Saudi Arabia, who may be 4.
What do you know about his mother? You said she was Syrian?
Yeah. She apparently divorced Osama's father at some point, has since remarried. She's in pretty close touch with her son. She's visited him in Sudan when he lived there between 91 and 96. And she was also at her grandson's wedding, which happened early this year in Afghanistan. So she keeps in touch with her son.
Any idea what she's like?
No.
Ever seen a picture of her?
No. I mean, one thing you've got to understand is that, you know, the notion of a sort of, let's say the notion of a picture of Osama's wife, or just, you know, or an interview with Osama's wife, or something like that. It's just, you know, it's not going to happen.
What countries in the world did Osama bin Laden live in?
Well, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sudan, Saudi Arabia.
Where did he get his education?
Saudi Arabia. He studied economics and public administration.
And when did he get his money?
Well, his father dies in 67. All the kids are pretty young. Like even Osama's oldest brother at that time would have only been 20. And so the family company was sort of put in trust, and the estate was only divided in the 80s. And bin Laden apparently got about $35 million. And I know that because I talked to somebody who was somewhat privy to the division of the estate. It's less than, you know, there were estimates that he had a lot more money than that, but still $35 million is $35 million. And then, you know, at a certain point he becomes probably the biggest businessman in Sudan between 91 and 96. It's really a very intense period of business. One of the, you know, I say in the book, it was almost Holy War Inc. It really was Holy War Inc. in the sense that he had this huge array of businesses, from tanneries to bakeries to banks to construction businesses to trucking companies to, you know, import, export. Basically, and cornering the market in certain of Sudanese agricultural products, but at the same time running these paramilitary camps. So, you know, when I call the book Holy War Inc., that was one of the reasons. I mean, it was partly also a play on the Murder Inc. notion, but But also, you know, bin Laden comes out of a business background. You know, he studied economics. His family's business is very successful. He established himself as a very big businessman in Sudan. The Al-Qaeda, the business of terrorism, almost was set up in a pretty rational manner. You know, there were political arms and religious arms and business arms and media arm, and I mean all that's gone now, of course, because Al-Qaeda is about to go out of business for the long term.
What's Osama mean in English?
Lion.
What does Al-Qaeda mean?
The base.
And when did he start it?
1989. When the basis of the base, as it were, is that after the Soviets withdrew in February '89 from Afghanistan, you know, bin Laden recruited all these people from around the world for holy wars, and they all got some sort of military experience and rubbed shoulders and got to know each other. And there's sort of this international cast of sort of holy warriors, as it were. A lot of them wanted to do other, you know, change their governments in their native countries like Egypt, or, you know, foment rebellion in various other places, or eventually, in bin Laden's case, attack the United States. So Al-Qaeda became the basis for the Al-Qaeda sort of sprang out of all those people who would travel to Afghanistan.
Go to back to the reason that he hates the United States.
Yeah.
When did you figure that it all actually started?
It starts on a date, August the 7th, 1990. I mean, not that it happened overnight. Bin Laden had been anti-American for a long time.
Where was he living then?
He was living in Saudi Arabia, and that was the day that President Bush announced Operation Desert Shield, which effectively meant the introduction of several 100,000 Americans into Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden, you know, there were women, you know, that was the worst, women soldiers trespassing on the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. That was terrible as far as bin Laden was concerned. And the reason that it's, you know, one thing that makes it very clear to me why, several things is, you know, 8 years later to the day, bin Laden's men blow up 2 U.S. embassies in Africa within 9 minutes of each other. And that was sending a very clear signal. I mean, this August the 7th moment was very critical, because 8 years later that causes bin Laden's biggest sort of terrorist outrage to date. So he was sending a message, and, you know, he's been very consistent about, you know, these people are on the lands of the Prophet Muhammad and they need to be expelled. And he's been very consistent about that, whether it was in the videotape that indicates his guilt in the Trade Center, where he mentions this kind of thing, or all of his public statements usually mention this.
Go back to the beginning again.
Yeah.
You said he had been given $35 million, and we've seen all kinds of figures along the way. How much do you think he's been worth over the years after the construction company and all?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, he's always had access to some money, but at the end of the day, the money's sort of a bit of a red herring, in the sense that, you know, you can't, it's not about money, it's about belief. And the people that he recruits to him aren't paid, you know, they're volunteers, they're not mercenaries. And the people who die in these operations, clearly you can't, there's no amount of money you can give to somebody like Mohammed Atta, who came from a prosperous Egyptian family himself anyway, to persuade him to fly a 747 into the World Trade Center. So I think the money has been important, but it's not been vital to bin Laden's project. What's been vital is his ability to transfer a lot of rage against the United States, perhaps, you know, taking the sort of localized rage of people against, you know, there are all sorts of Middle Eastern governments which are authoritarian and corrupt, etc., etc. But someone was saying, making the analysis, it's all the United States' fault for all these problems, and getting people to go along with that idea, and being able to organize them and recruit them, and giving them the training to become quite deadly. That's bin Laden's genius. It's not his money.
Have you met al-Zawahiri?
No, he kept a low profile.
The number two, is he number two?
Yeah.
Do you think he's alive?
He shows up in the videotape, of course, the Trade Center, where bin Laden takes responsibility for the Trade Center. It's hard to tell. I mean, there were reports that he was dead, and they seem to be not that accurate.
But his family's dead.
Yes, the family is dead. Apparently, they took out a death notice in some Egyptian newspaper. So you
say in the book you met Atef.
Yes.
No.
Well, actually, I didn't actually meet with him. I corresponded with him.
Who was he?
He's the now deceased military commander. But I mean, when I was dealing with him, I wasn't quite sure if he was the military commander or not. I thought that he was simply one of the media advisors, but apparently he's one and the same person. And we corresponded after the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Africa and the subsequent cruise missile strikes against bin Laden's camp in Afghanistan. And I was trying to get another interview, but we corresponded by fax from the Kabul post office to my hotel room in Pakistan. And in the end, the message came that it wasn't, they just didn't think it was a good idea.
What about this book? When did you get the idea to do this book? And I know it was finished in August,
yeah.
And then, of course, now you changed it a lot by the time I got my hands on it.
Well, I got the idea to write the book. I mean, I always wanted to write a book, and it just seemed like a good... I mean, to me, the main thing is I was interested in the subject, and that kind of subject is... you know, bin Laden is an interesting... Obviously, he's an interesting personality and phenomenon. Of course, you know, when I was starting it, I had no idea that, you know, we'd be talking about September 11th or events like this, but I just thought that if I was interested in the subject, and that somehow other people would be too, and you know, I mean, I think it's a general proposition. I think that's a good way to operate. I mean, if you're not if the writer isn't interested particularly, who else is going to care? I mean, you have to think it's an interesting subject. You have to be engaged in it.
Let me ask you some minor book questions. When you originally wrote the book and finished it in August of this year, how many copies of this were they going to publish?
I'm not sure, but they told me they read the manuscript. They said we're going to double projections. Now, doubling it from probably a very low number, you know, it would have been, I don't know, but
free press, what, 10, 15,000?
I think they were going to double it from 10 to 20, maybe. Let's say hypothetically. They never told me the figures. They said they were going to double it to something beyond what they previously thought.
The book was done, and you had it at the publisher in August.
It wasn't done. I handed in my manuscript, but it needed work on August 30th.
So what happened on September 11th?
I think at a certain point I spoke to my editor, Rachel Clayman, and said to her, I mean, I don't know if it was on the 11th or not, because that whole day was so mad. But we talked about, you know, what are we going to do? And, you know, the obvious thing to do is, you know, of all the times to get the book out, it was now. I mean, people wanted, for a lot of people, bin Laden, you know, could have been bin Laden. I mean, they'd never heard of the guy. They didn't know, you know, the events of September 11th came like a bolt out of the blue. I mean, it was a very beautiful day, and it just suddenly this thing happened. It was like, oh, how did that happen? It was almost inexplicable. But the fact is, it was explicable to some degree. I mean, as soon as the second plane hit, to me, it was, who else would have had the motivation and the kind of organization to pull this off? So we talked. I mean, Rachel, my editor, was I can't remember very much of the conversations because there were so many things going on. But we basically, you know, agreed we just have to get this done. And Rachel, my editor, very kindly came down to Washington for about 4 or 5 days, and we just basically worked. I mean, at a certain point, it's like you can't have these conversations over the phone. You just have to be with your editor, and we just worked around the clock to get it out.
And you've gone as far as to have this note at the bottom of the flap: both author and publisher will donate a portion of their proceeds from this book to United Way's September 11th Fund. What's the percentage you're going to give it?
I think it's some routine percentage, which is, I mean, industry standard.
But what happened about the printing of this book? How many copies did you originally print? And it has been on the bestseller list.
I think it's they announced a print run of 250,000. That doesn't mean anything. I mean, that doesn't mean you're going to sell 250,000. I mean, there might be, you know, a lot sent back. I mean, I know more about publishing than I used to now, which is the point is you've got to print more than you're going to, because the worst thing is not to be able to have it in the shops when you need it. But, you know, I think that, I mean, I hope I'm doing something of a service in the sense that the book may help people understand that, you know, September 11th did not emerge out of a vacuum. This guy has been planning these kinds of attacks against American targets since the early 90s, and his organization has been involved in attacks against Americans since the early 90s. And unfortunately what happened is that these attacks just got more complex and more deadly, and they've sort of, you know, there was a kind of accelerating curve upwards of attacks, and you know, hopefully the book will make that clear. I think that if you read the book at the end of when you put it down, I hope you'd say to yourself, now I kind of understand how that wasn't entirely a bolt out of the blue. I think that bin Laden, by the way, you know, I think September 11th, he wanted to provoke some sort of clash of civilizations. It was a total failure. The striking thing to me, but you can't justify the September 11th attacks Islamically, I mean, in Islam. There's no language to justify it. And bin Laden doesn't even try and justify it. I mean, when he says, when people ask him why these assaults on American citizens, he says, well, they pay taxes and therefore they're complicit. But that's hardly a sort of justification, a religious justification. And, you know, his message has had zero resonance, or very little, in the Muslim world. You have not seen millions of people getting on the streets saying, Osama, Osama, Osama. On the contrary, you know, the demonstrations have been tiny. And you've seen every Middle Eastern government lining up to help against bin Laden, because they understand he's a threat to them. And I think the videotape, you know, if there was any doubt that he was involved, surely that would expunge it. And it makes it clear that he's you know, a rather, I don't know, it's hard to find the words, but certainly it's a really, his joviality on the videotape was really pretty unpleasant. And he is, I'll tell you what, Brian, what I think about him. We've seen a lot of his type in the past century, which is like, I know how to create the perfect omelette, and it doesn't matter how many eggs are necessary to break to make that omelette. And we've seen that again and again and again. I'm not talking about, you know, whether that was Pol Pot or Stalin or Mao. These are all very different people. And I can't compare bin Laden to all these people in the sense that his victims are his victims, but they all share one absolutely common thing, which is, I know how to create paradise on earth. I'm absolutely certain about it. And if other people don't understand that, you know, sort of, they're wrong. And not only that, we should be able to kill them. And you see that again and again. The worst person, in my view, is the person who thinks that they have the perfect answer, because they think they're going to create paradise here on earth if their solutions are implemented. As it happens, they tend to create hells on earth for people. Anybody with that level of certainty is almost certainly wrong, and will probably do a lot of damage.
So what is in the book that would help somebody understand a post-bin Laden period, a post-Zawahiri, you know, Atef, all these people that you write about in here? Sheikh Rahman's, how many of his sons were?
A couple of sons, yeah.
Killed? Over?
One of them's dead. One of them's been killed, apparently.
He's in jail here?
He's in Minnesota, yeah. The Sheikh Rahman.
Yeah. And
well, I think after bin Laden, and I think they were such an unusual phenomenon. I think when bin Laden and his top leadership are eliminated or captured or whatever, and the terrorist training camps in Afghanistan are closed permanently, which they are in the process of being, you know, you're going to revert to a situation that existed before, which was terrorism was a major irritant, but it wasn't like the major national security threat facing the United States, which it became on September 11th.
What did you think of the decision then on the part of this government to go after?
They did it. I think
the network.
They've done a brilliant job. I mean, it's very hard to fault them on anything. I mean, you know, it is clear from bin Laden's statements that that he possibly possesses some sort of radioactive weapon, not an atomic weapon in conventional. I mean, with this group, all bets are off. So, you know, in a very aggressive effort to kind of get them, I mean, it's quite clear bin Laden has no qualms about killing civilians, including Muslim civilians, because he's killed a lot of them, whether it was in the World Trade Center attacks or in the U.S. Embassy bombing attacks. You know, the U.S. Embassy bombing attacks killed 200 Africans, and Kenya and Tanzania are about 30% Muslim. So up till the, you know, he certainly killed a lot more Muslims than Americans up till September 11th. You know, and so he doesn't have, you know, there are no checks for bin Laden. There's no, I think if you know, he and his followers are ready to do as much damage as they can. And so at that point, it's a pure matter of self-preservation. I mean, I'm not a sort of militaristic sort of person, but, you know, if there's ever a reason to go to war, the catastrophic death of, you know, thousands of civilians, and on doing it in a very aggressive way, I mean, how can you fault that?
We'll go back to when we started talking about your life at ABC. What what'd you call that first job?
Desk assistant. Oh,
just a desk assistant. you were basically a gopher?
Gopher, yeah.
And how many short years? What was the date of that again?
That started at 85.
85 to 2001. What's this impact on your life?
This book.
Today, this book, your knowledge about that part of the world, this story. Are you back with CNN full time?
No. I mean, I'd like to continue working with CNN in a part-time capacity. I mean, I've worked for 15 years now for other organizations, and to the extent that it would be possible to be independent, I'd like to do that and write other books and perhaps other articles. But the impact of this book on my life, well, I mean, I hope that I can write another book, basically. I mean, you know.
But how about the impact of this whole story on your life?
Well, I mean, it's been very, I don't know, it's been very hard sometimes because, you know, the events, I was here in Washington on September 11th, and the whole thing was, I don't know, it was very, very dreadful, really. The whole, I found it, and
Where were you when it happened?
I was at home. My father was watching television. He told me that a plane had hit the Trade Center, and sometimes he's fond of sort of not very funny jokes, and I thought he was joking, but when I came down and saw it, and then the second plane hit, and as soon as that happened, I called up Keith McAllister, the national editor of CNN, and his office said, just, you know, come here immediately. And it was pretty obvious to anybody who followed these things it was bin Laden. And I took a cab in, and it was very, you remember the day, it was very unclear about what was happening. What were the targets? I mean, I remember there was a report that the State Department was perhaps on fire or had been bombed, and the Pentagon was on fire. And all these reports, and then suddenly this other report came in, it's like much stronger, a more urgent report. You know, the entire tower of the Trade Center had collapsed. And my Ethiopian cab driver, I'll never forget it, he just burst into tears. And it was very, I mean, I burst into tears as well, actually, because it just, you know, you knew how many people I mean, I thought I knew how many people had died in that attack, and it was very hard to go on. But, you know, I went to CNN, and I was talking to one of the correspondents there, and I was saying, yeah, maybe CNN isn't such a smart place to be either. I mean, who knows? You know, because it wasn't clear what the objective was. I mean, so it was a very difficult day. And then, anyway, the main thing about it is that it sort of gives me no joy that the book is going to be more widely read. I mean, certainly, you know, it would be far better to rewind the clock back. You know, one of the things that strike me about bin Laden is that he's a sort of James Bond villain in a way. But if it was a real James Bond movie, you know, James Bond would have come in and got rid of bin Laden. The trade centers would be standing, and unfortunately, life's not a movie. I mean, the trade centers fell, and bin Laden is, you know, able to get away with it. It seems. Go
back to that meeting you had with him in 1997.
Yeah.
What are the other little things that you remember from that meeting? Circumstances.
He at the end of the meeting, he didn't want to hang around for very long, but he served us some cup of tea. I remember himself, and he lingered just basically to have some pictures taken, and we got some other shots of him, and he Peter Arnett had interviewed Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War, and so Peter Arnett talked to him about Saddam Hussein, and he said a very interesting thing. He said Saddam Hussein's a bad Muslim, and he sees Kuwait for his own self-aggrandizement, both of which are factually correct statements, but it was an early indicator to me that bin Laden regards someone like Saddam Hussein as basically a heretic. So
did you shake hands with him?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think it was ever. The situation never came up whether it was a shake of a hand or not. He just sat down. I don't think we shook hands at all. No, come to think of it, I never really thought about it until now.
What about the people around him? We talked a little bit about that earlier. Did they know who you were? Did they have a grasp of what you were going to do with it?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly the translator spoke excellent English. Then a number of the people knew that, you know, they understood it was CNN. They understood it was an interview.
Did they watch CNN?
Not in Afghanistan, because, you know, most places don't have electricity.
You report in the book that he bought a $7,500 satellite telephone in New York for $75
from a New York company. Yeah.
Yeah, but then abandoned the use of the satellite telephone.
Right. Probably he abandoned it maybe personally. I mean, his aides may have used that same satellite phone. I mean, he's not stupid, and he understood that his voice print is distinctive, and the satellite sweep looking for this voice. And in '97, his colleague in London said that bin Laden was not chatting away on his satellite phone, because he's been the subject of a number of rather serious assassination attempts by his native Saudi government. So he's very, very, very security conscious.
Well, looking back in a couple minutes we have left, what job do you think? How would you grade the media during this period of time? And as all that you knew about this, have you often looked at the set or read an article and say, a bunch of misinformation?
I think overall the media, particularly after September, the media has done an amazing job. I think CNN's done a very good job. I think the New York Times should be awarded 20 Pulitzers tomorrow. I think the Washington Post has done a very good job. I mean, the fact is, one thing that strikes me, Brian, is very interesting. If you do polls on the relative standing of the media, on September 10th, the media was regarded with lawyers, when we were talking about Gary Condit and stuff, down at 20%. And now we're doing a job the public needs us to do, and we're up at, you know, whatever, 70 or 80%. I mean, so the public, you know, I think it sort of it unleashed a lot of people to actually do the jobs they wanted. I mean, no one really wants to cover Gary Condit or that kind of stuff at the end of the day.
What would you like to do next, specifically? What topic? What area?
I would like to go back to Afghanistan and find out what happened. I think when the smoke clears a bit, you know, and I mean, there are a lot of other things that are going on right now, but I think the opportunity to go back to Afghanistan and talk to some of the players, find out how this all happened, and sort of basically the part 2 of this book, as it were.
Where will you go first?
Well, I'd probably go to Kabul, just because you need to get the various permissions and talk to the people there. And
Well, who are you going to look for to talk to?
Well, I think, you know, the 2 people who are going to know a lot about the situation are Dr. Abdullah, the foreign minister. You know, Abdullah's been tracking the bin Laden group for years, because they were fighting the bin Laden group on the front lines with the Taliban. And also, you know, the Karzais in Kandahar, they're going to be people who have information about what was the final disposition of where Mullah Omar was, and what was the final, where was bin Laden. I mean, all these are the people who are going to really know what happened on the ground.
And what's your suspicion as to how the United States got the tape?
That is a very good question. I just have no idea. I mean, they aren't saying, so it sounds like somebody left the house in a hurry and just left a tape, and maybe it was mislabeled. I mean, you work in the, you know how often tapes get mislabeled or whatever. I don't know. It was a mistake. Somebody left it there.
Is there a moral to all this story?
People who have God on, people who believe that God is really on their side, you know, it's very unlikely that God has decided to get on your side. I mean, I don't think God works like that. And bin Laden really believes that God got on his side. And that's, I don't know, it's not a very useful way of looking at the world. I mean, and also if you believe that God is on your side, you believe everything you can do is divinely sanctioned, and therefore anything you do is right. And it's a very dangerous thing.
This is the cover of the book. It's called Holy War, Inc. Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden. Our guest has been Peter L. Bergen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.